She grabbed the handles of his wheelchair without asking permission. That was the first thing Do-hyun noticed. Not her smile, not her voice, not the way the club lights caught something in her eyes. Just her hands, confident, unapologetic, wrapping around the handles of his chair like she had every right in the world. His two bodyguards moved instantly. She spun on them with a laugh, an actual laugh, loud enough to cut through the bass, and said, "Oh, relax, giants. I'm not stealing him. I'm rescuing him." Nobody laughed at Kang Do-hyun's men. Nobody touched his chair without explicit clearance. Nobody in Seoul with any knowledge of who sat in that wheelchair would have dared breathe in his direction without permission. This woman had no knowledge of any of that. And somehow, that made her the most dangerous person in the room. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when an immovable life gets cracked open by something small and impossible, stay with this story. Hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled, and subscribe if you haven't yet, because the stories coming to this channel will find you in places you didn't expect. Now let's go back to that night, the night everything changed. Kang Do-hyun had not chosen the nightclub. That was the first thing people always got wrong about him. They assumed a man with his money, his reach, his particular reputation went places because he wanted to. He didn't. I went places because security protocol demanded it, because his lieutenant Min Jae had decided the quarterly tribute from the Gangnam Entertainment District needed to be collected in person this cycle, because appearances mattered in their world the way oxygen mattered everywhere else, quietly, constantly, non-negotiably. The club was called Mirage. It occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower in Cheongdam-dong, the kind of establishment where the cocktails had names in 3 languages and the waitstaff had been trained to recognize power by how little noise it made. Do-hyun's table was in the private mezzanine, separated from the general floor by frosted glass, and 2 men who communicated exclusively through earpieces. He sat there with his usual glass of mineral water. He didn't drink at business, and watched the crowd below with the particular detachment of someone who had learned to observe the living from a safe distance. He was 41 years old. He had been in a wheelchair for 12 of those years. Most people in his position would have built a mythology around the injury, would have weaponized it, made it into a story about survival and iron will, positioned the wheelchair as a throne rather than a prison. Do-hyun had done none of that. He referred to it exactly once in business context, a single sentence delivered without inflection, and then moved on. What happened to his spine in the basement of a building in Incheon 12 years ago was not a story. It was a fact. Facts didn't require narration. What he had never told anyone, including Min Jae, including his personal physician Dr. Shin, was that the fact had also become a grief so dense and familiar that he had simply built his entire life around it, the way a river builds around stone. Not over it. Not through it. Around. He watched a couple on the dance floor below, young, laughing at each other with the specific quality of laugh that comes from knowing the other person's laugh is coming. The woman reached up and fixed the man's collar, and the man caught her hand and held it there against his chest for a moment, and then they kept dancing. Do-hyun looked away. Min Jae materialized at his shoulder, a compact man in his late 30s with the contained energy of a watch spring, always wound, never quite released. "Tributes confirmed," he said quietly. "Sung-wook sends his respects." "His respects," Do-hyun repeated. "And 12% over the previous quarter. Tell him his respects are accepted." He reached for his water. "We leave in 40 minutes. "Yes, sir." Min Jae didn't move. That in itself was information. Do-hyun glanced at him sideways. "What?" "Nothing, sir." "Min Jae." The man's jaw shifted slightly. "You've been watching the floor for 20 minutes. I'm watching our territory." "You've been watching the couple by the east speaker." Do-hyun set down his water with a precision that was its own kind of warning. Min Jae, who had known him for 14 years and had survived situations that would have broken other men simply by reading Do-hyun's silences correctly, went immediately still. 40 minutes, Do-hyun said. "Yes, sir." He did not look back at the couple. He looked instead at the far corner of the dance floor, where the crowd had parted slightly around a woman dancing alone. Not in the desperate way people danced alone when they wished they weren't, but in the specific and unapologetic way of someone who was having a genuinely good time and happened to not require a partner for it. She was tall, She wore something dark red that moved when she did. She was black. American, he would later learn, though he didn't know that yet, with natural hair pulled up loosely, and she was dancing with the particular freedom of someone who did not know or care that anyone was watching. Do-hyun was watching. He noted this about himself the way he noted most things, clinically, without attaching significance to it. She was interesting to observe. That was all. People were occasionally interesting to observe. He observed them. He moved on. Except he didn't move on. He watched her for 11 minutes. He knew because he was a man who tracked time the way other men tracked money. Precisely, constantly, instinctively. And the fact that 11 minutes passed while his attention stayed fixed on a single point told him something he chose not to examine too closely. Then the crowd shifted, someone moved, and she looked up. Directly at the mezzanine. Directly at him. He should have looked away. Any reasonable person with his history and his habits and 12 years of practiced self-containment would have looked away. He didn't. She tilted her head. Then, and this was the thing, this was the part that stayed with him for weeks afterward, she smiled. Not a flirtatious smile, not an impressed smile, not the carefully calibrated expression women sometimes offered powerful men in expensive clubs. Just a genuine, slightly surprised smile, the kind you produce when something unexpectedly delights you. As if she found it funny that some man up in the mezzanine had been watching her dance. As if she found him, specifically him, kind of funny. Nobody found Kang Do-hyun funny. He looked away. He checked his watch. He told himself he was done. 17 minutes later, she was standing 2 feet from his table. The bodyguards had, technically, stopped her. She was not inside the frosted glass partition. She was standing at the edge of it, with the particular posture of someone who had been told no and was deciding how much she agreed with that assessment. She was closer now, close enough that he could see her face properly. And she was looking not at the guards, but past them, at him. "I just want to ask him something," she said. Her Korean was non-existent, pure American English, the cadence of it warm and unhurried. One of the guards said something in Korean. She spread her hands. "I literally don't understand what you're saying. Look." She glanced past them again and found his eyes, and said directly to him, "I'm not a threat, I promise. I just wanted to say hi. That's it. I'll go." She was already turning to leave. Do-hyun said in English, "What did you want to ask?" The guard nearest him turned with an expression that suggested he had momentarily forgotten how the universe worked. Min-jae, behind Do-hyun's left shoulder, went absolutely still. She turned back. The surprise on her face was unguarded, genuine. "Oh, you speak English. You wanted to ask something." She studied him for a moment. Then she said, "Why aren't you dancing?" The question landed in the mezzanine with a strange weight. Do-hyun felt something move through him that he couldn't immediately name. Not offense, not amusement, something older and stranger than either. "I don't dance," he said. "Why not?" His jaw tightened by a fraction. "I'm not able to." She looked at him, at his face, not at the wheelchair, which people almost always looked at when he said something like that, the way eyes go to the wound rather than the person. And she said, "Says who?" Min-jae made a small sound. Do-hyun looked at this woman who had appeared from the dance floor below and walked past his security and asked him why he wasn't dancing, and felt the strangest sensation move through his chest, something that might, in a different life, have been the beginning of a laugh. "Says my spine," he said. "Your spine's not out there." She nodded toward the floor below. "The music is." He should have dismissed her. That was the correct move, the reasonable move, the move that every functioning instinct in his body had been trained to make when variables appeared that didn't fit the established order of things. He should have said something brief and conclusive and let the guards manage the rest. Instead, he said, "What's your name?" "Zuri?" She tilted her head slightly. "Yours?" Nobody in this club would have asked him that. Nobody in Cheongdam-dong would have asked him that. The question assumed ignorance of him, assumed he was a person rather than a position, and the assumption was so foreign that for a moment he genuinely didn't know how to respond. "Do-hyun," he said. "Do-hyun." She tried the syllables carefully. "Okay, so Do-hyun." She took one step closer, still outside the partition. "What's it going to take to get you on that floor?" Nothing, he said. It isn't going to happen. You've been watching the floor for almost half an hour. He felt something shift in him, a sudden cold alertness, the kind his body produced when someone said something that demonstrated they knew more about him than they should. You noticed that from down there. I notice things. She shrugged, loose and unconcerned. And the thing I noticed is that you look like somebody who used to dance. The accuracy of that sentence was so precise and so unexpected that it hit him somewhere behind the sternum. He had, in fact, danced. Before. In the life that existed before Incheon, before the basement, before 12 years of learning to live in the absence of something he used to do without thinking. He had not told her that. She could not have known that. You don't know anything about me, he said. No, she agreed. That's the point. I just see a man in a nice suit who's been watching other people have fun for too long. She glanced over her shoulder at the floor below, then back at him. Come down. One song. I'm in a wheelchair. I have eyes. She said it without cruelty, without softness, just fact meeting fact. There's a flat section by the east bar. Plenty of room. I've been dancing there all night. You're not understanding me. I understand you fine. She met his gaze steadily. I just don't think the wheelchair is the actual reason. Min-jae, behind him, had the specific quality of silence that meant he was actively preventing himself from speaking. Do-hyun looked at Zuri Bennett. This woman he had watched for 11 minutes from a mezzanine and would, by the end of the night, have searched 3 continents to find again, and understood that she had said something true. The wheelchair was a fact. But it was not the reason. The reason was older and darker and considerably harder to name, and she had seen it from a dance floor 30 feet below without knowing a single thing about him. He said to Min-jae, "Move the partition." Min-jae did not visibly react. This was something Do-hyun had always respected about him. The man had committed long ago to never showing surprise in the field. He simply nodded and said quietly, "Yes, sir," and moved. Zuri stepped back and waited while the physical barrier was shifted. When Do-hyun wheeled toward the exit ramp, she fell into step beside him without crowding, without hovering, without doing the thing people always did when they walked near his chair. That slightly slowed, slightly bent accommodation, the unconscious performance of inclusion. She just walked, at his pace, beside him. They rode the elevator to the main floor. Neither spoke. The music got louder as they descended. When they emerged onto the edge of the dance floor, she turned and held out her hand. Not to help him, not to guide him, just an offered hand, the kind you extend before a dance. He looked at it. He looked at her. "I told you," he said. "I can't." "I heard you." She kept her hand out. "But I want you to try." "You don't understand what you're asking." "Maybe not." Her eyes were steady. "Try anyway." He had not tried anything in 12 years. Trying implied possibility, and possibility implied disappointment. And Do-hyun had decided a long time ago that disappointment was a cost he had already paid too many times to keep paying. He had arranged his entire internal architecture around the elimination of hope because hope was simply deferred grief, and he had enough grief already. He reached out and took her hand. She didn't react to that either. No triumph, no pity, just a slight warm tightening of her fingers around his. She moved to his side, and what happened next would stay with him, in detail, for the rest of his life. He pushed himself upright. He didn't know why. He had no medical explanation and would spend considerable time afterward consulting with people who also had no medical explanation. He simply stood. Hands on the armrests, weight shifting, and then he was standing and the room did not collapse and his legs did not give, and he was upright in a way he had not been in 12 years, and the music moved through the floor into his feet, and he felt it. The way you feel something that your body remembers even when your mind has given up on the memory. Zuri looked up at him. He was taller than she'd expected. That much was visible on her face. And she didn't gasp, didn't exclaim, didn't perform shock. She just adjusted her grip and started to move. They danced. He didn't dance well. That was the truth of it. Whatever muscle memory he'd once had was rusty and inconsistent, and there were moments where his weight shifted wrong and she steadied him with a matter-of-fact firmness that asked no questions. But they danced. 3 songs, because when the first ended she was already moving into the second, and he found, to his own bewilderment, that he followed. Min-jae stood at the edge of the floor with his arms crossed and his face carefully professional and his eyes doing something complicated that Do-hyun pointedly did not look at. The third song ended. Zuri stepped back and looked at him with an expression he could not fully read. Warm, a little wondering, something in it that wasn't quite satisfied and wasn't quite finished either, like someone who had solved part of a problem and couldn't decide if the rest of it was hers to solve. "See?" she said. "I'm going to sit down," he said. His legs were shaking. His whole body was doing something that wasn't pain exactly, but was adjacent to it. The specific exhaustion of systems suddenly called back into use. "Yeah, you should." She reached out and touched his arm, just briefly, the lightest pressure. And he sat. He meant to ask for her number. He meant to ask where she was staying, whether she lived in Seoul, what her last name was. He meant to do all of these things, and he did none of them, because the moment he sat, Min-jae was at his shoulder with the clipped urgency of a problem requiring attention, and by the time he looked back toward where she had been standing, she was gone. The crowd had moved. The music had changed. There was no trace of a woman in dark red anywhere in his sight line. Do-hyun sat in his wheelchair on the edge of the dance floor of a club called Mirage, and understood, with the quiet certainty of a man who had survived 12 years of accepting what couldn't be changed, that something had just changed. He didn't sleep that night. Not because of excitement, he would have found excitement embarrassing, but because something in his legs was different, a warmth, a low electrical hum that had not been there when he woke that morning. He lay in the dark of his bedroom and felt it and didn't tell himself what it meant. He waited. In the morning, he called Min-jae. "Find her," he said. "Sir?" "The woman from last night. Find her." A brief pause. "Do you have a last name?" "Zuri?" He paused. "American. I'd estimate early 30s, natural hair. She was alone at the club." "That's—" Min-jae stopped himself. "I'll start immediately." "Good." Another pause. Min-jae was choosing words which meant the words mattered. "Sir, last night, the standing. Don't. I just— Min-jae." Silence. Then, "Yes, sir. I'll find her." Do-hyun hung up and sat at the edge of his bed in the gray Seoul morning and looked at his legs. He pressed one hand against his thigh. There was something there. Not full sensation, not the complete return of everything that had gone dark 12 years ago, but a warmth, a presence. Something that was not nothing. He told himself it was coincidence. He told himself that 3 times before he stopped believing it. The search took 11 days. Do-hyun knew this because he had been counting, which was itself a problem. He was not a man who counted things that didn't affect his bottom line, and a woman who had danced with him for 3 songs and then vanished into a crowd did not, by any reasonable business calculation, affect his bottom line. He counted anyway. 11 days of Min-jae's reports arriving twice daily, each one a variation of the same sentence. "Nothing yet, sir." 11 days of Do-hyun sitting at his desk going through the normal machinery of his empire, territory disputes, supply chain negotiations, a disciplinary matter in Busan that required his personal signature, while some part of his attention stayed fixed on a woman in dark red who had held out her hand and said, "Try anyway." On the 11th day, Min-jae came into the office and said nothing. Do-hyun looked up. "What?" "She's gone, sir." Min-jae set a thin folder on the desk. "Zuri Bennett, American national, 29 years old, from Atlanta, Georgia. She entered South Korea on a tourist visa 18 days ago. Her return flight was canceled, an airline systems failure 11 days ago. Same night she disappeared from our tracking." Do-hyun opened the folder. A photocopy of a passport page. A flight itinerary with a large red "canceled" stamped across it. A hotel receipt, 3 nights at a mid-range place near Hongdae, checked out 4 days ago. "And after checkout?" he said. "Nothing." Min-jae's voice had a quality in it that Do-hyun recognized as carefully neutral. No subsequent hotel registrations. No new flight bookings. Her bank account, we accessed the records, shows she withdrew cash after checkout. Small amounts. She's been managing on whatever she had on hand. Do-hyun looked at the passport photo. It was a bad photo, the way all passport photos were bad photos. Flat light, stiff expression, nothing of the actual person in it. But the eyes were the same, he recognized those. "She's still in Seoul," he said. "Almost certainly. She can't afford to leave." He closed the folder. He sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "Find her a position." Min-jae's neutral expression flickered. "Sir?" "One of the properties. Something residential. She needs income." "You want to—" Min-jae stopped, restarted. "You want to hire her?" "I want to ensure she has a reason to stay in one place long enough for us to locate her." Do-hyun pushed the folder back across the desk. "Use the Bukhan-san estate. It needs domestic staff." "The estate." Min-jae's voice had gone very careful. "Your personal residence. It's the most secure location I control. If I'm going to make contact, I'd rather do it on controlled ground." Silence. The specific silence of a man who had 14 years of loyalty and enough intelligence to understand what was actually being said, choosing his next words with the kind of precision usually reserved for disarming things. "And when she arrives," Min-jae said, "will you be—" "I'll be there." Do-hyun picked up the next document in his stack. "Arrange it. Don't use my name in the posting." I was already reading. Min-jae knew, and Do-hyun knew that Min-jae knew, that the reading was a performance. Neither of them acknowledged this. Min-jae took the folder and left. The estate sat against the lower slope of Bukhan-san, surrounded by old pine trees that were doing something complicated with the light at every hour of the day. Do-hyun had bought it 7 years ago because it was defensible and private and large enough to contain a full security apparatus without that apparatus being visible. He had never thought of it as beautiful. He had never thought of it as anything except functional. Zuri Bennett arrived on a Tuesday morning with a single rolling suitcase and the expression of someone who had decided to be practical about unexpected turns. She was shown in by the estate manager, a compact woman named Mrs. O, who communicated primarily through directional nods, and given the household orientation while Do-hyun watched through the security feed in his office. She asked 3 questions during the orientation. The first was about the kitchen layout. The second was about the location of the cleaning supply storage. The third was whether the Wi-Fi password had any special characters, because she had a cousin back in Atlanta who worried and she needed to check in. Mrs. O gave her the Wi-Fi password. Zuri thanked her and meant it. Do-hyun could tell because the thank you was smaller than a performed thank you, just a natural brief thing that people said when they actually felt it. He turned off the feed and told himself he was done watching. He watched for another 40 minutes. The problem was the corridor. The house had a specific architectural logic: main residence on the east wing, staff and service areas on the west, connected by a long central corridor with a kitchen at its midpoint. Do-hyun used the kitchen at irregular hours, usually late morning when the house was quiet, because his physician had prescribed a particular supplement regime that he couldn't stomach without food, and the kitchen was faster than calling staff. It was a small, private habit. It had never been a problem before. The first time he came around the corner into the kitchen and found Zuri there was on her second day. She had her back to him. She was making tea, actual tea, not from a bag but from something loose in a strainer, moving around the unfamiliar kitchen with the adaptive efficiency of someone who had worked in other people's spaces before. She was humming something low and half-formed under her breath. His wheelchair was quieter than most. She didn't hear him. He should have announced himself. He should have said something, made a sound, given her the reasonable human warning of his presence. He didn't, because in the half-second between entering and speaking, she turned. The hum stopped. They looked at each other across the kitchen island. She didn't recognize him. He could see that clearly. The polite, slightly cautious expression of an employee encountering her employer for the first time. No flash of the club, no click of recognition. Her eyes moved to the wheelchair, then back to his face, with the particular practiced neutrality of someone who had decided ahead of time not to make anything of it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know anyone was up. I can come back." "Don't." He wheeled forward to his usual position near the counter. "I use the kitchen at this hour regularly." "Okay." She turned back to her tea, giving him space without vacating it, which was a more sophisticated reading of the situation than he'd expected. "Do you need anything? I can manage." "I know you can." She said it without looking at him, matter of fact, and he felt something move in him that might have been amusement if he'd let it develop. He got his supplement from the cabinet. He took it with water. She poured her tea. They occupied the kitchen with the slightly careful geometry of 2 strangers who had landed in the same small space and were managing it. Then she said, "This is a beautiful house." "It's functional," he said. "Sure." She wrapped both hands around her mug. Still beautiful. He looked at the side of her face. The morning light was doing something specific to her features, finding angles he hadn't seen in the club's dark. She looked tired under the surface of composed. The kind of tired that had been running for a while. "How long have you been in Seoul?" he asked. She glanced at him. Brief calculation behind her eyes. Not suspicion, just the normal human question of how much context to give a stranger. "About 3 weeks now. It was supposed to be 10 days. What happened?" "Airline happened." A short, dry sound that was almost a laugh. "My flight home got canceled and rebooking was a disaster and I ran out of—" She stopped, edited herself. "I needed to make some money before I could get back." "You're from the United States." "Atlanta." She said it with a small involuntary warmth that told him something about her relationship with home. "You?" The question was entirely natural, the kind of thing people asked each other in kitchens in the morning, and Do-hyun registered with some abstract interest the fact that she was asking him where he was from inside his own house. "Seoul," he said, "born here." "Must be nice," she said, "knowing a city that well." She said it without self-pity, just observation. Then she picked up her mug and nodded, the small, efficient nod of someone returning to work, and left him alone in the kitchen. He sat there for longer than he needed to. This was the pattern for the first week. Kitchen encounters, corridor crossings, the specific domestic geography of two people inhabiting the same space at different frequencies. She was good at her work. Mrs. O's reports were uncharacteristically positive, which meant Zuri was probably excellent, and she was quiet in the way that didn't broadcast itself, that didn't perform quietness. She simply moved through the house without excess. Do-hyun found reasons to be in the central corridor more than usual. He noted this about himself without examining it closely. The thing he didn't account for was the legs. 4 days into her presence in the house, he was doing his nightly exercises, a regimen Dr. Shin had prescribed years ago, maintained with the same grimly faithful consistency with which he maintained everything, in the private room off his bedroom that contained a therapy table and various equipment. He had been doing these exercises for 12 years. They produced, consistently, nothing. Maintenance of existing function, prevention of further deterioration. That was all they had ever been. On the 4th night, his right leg moved. Not the muscular twitch that sometimes happened involuntarily. Not the reflexive response Dr. Shin catalogued with cautious hope, and Do-hyun had long since stopped attaching meaning to. A deliberate movement. He had thought push and the leg had pushed. Weak, imprecise, nothing like what a functional limb could do, but his, responding to him. He lay on the therapy table in the dark room and stared at the ceiling and breathed. He pushed again. The leg moved again. He did not call Dr. Shin. He did not call Min Jae. He lay there for a long time, feeling something he had eliminated from his operating system 12 years ago begin to press against its containment, and he thought about 3 dances in a nightclub and a woman who was currently asleep somewhere in the West Wing, and he told himself very firmly that correlation was not causation. He thought about it again at 2 in the morning, and at 4. By day 8, he was practicing at night. After the house went quiet, he would move to the long corridor between his room and the therapy space and attempt, in increments so small they were almost insulting, to stand. His hands on the walls. Weight shifting. Systems that had been silent for 12 years flickering back toward something. He fell twice. Both times he caught himself against the wall and waited, breathing, for the humiliation to pass. Then he tried again. On day 10, he stood for 37 seconds without his hands on anything. He sat back down and felt his entire body shaking with the effort and thought, "She can't know." The thought arrived completely formed, with a logic he understood even as he recognized it as irrational. If she knew, if anyone knew, it became a thing that could be observed, measured, discussed, potentially lost. It became hope, and hope was the thing he had protected himself against for 12 years. If he kept it private, kept it only in the space between his 4 walls, it couldn't be taken away. Also, and this part he admitted only in the furthest room of himself, if she knew, she would treat him differently. And she was the only person in his house, possibly in his life, who treated him like a man rather than a position. He wasn't willing to give that up for any amount of medical progress. Min-jae arrived on day 12 for the weekly briefing and found Do-hyun in a mood that he correctly identified as dangerous. The Incheon supply line is stable, Min-jae said, working through his list with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned to complete sentences quickly when the atmosphere in a room had a particular quality. The Daejeon situation resolved itself. Kim stepped down voluntarily once we made the alternative clear, and Busan reports the disciplinary matter is closed. Good. There's also... Min-jae paused with the specific micro-hesitation of someone approaching something they've been thinking about for longer than this moment. There's been some talk. Do-hyun didn't look up from the document he was signing. Talk. Among the outer tier, about the housekeeping situation. The pen stopped moving. Do-hyun set it down with care. He looked at Min-jae. What about it? Min-jae met his gaze directly, which was itself a form of commitment. People have noticed the hire. The estate hasn't had live-in domestic staff in 4 years. The specific timing, 11 days after your order to search for her, is the kind of detail that people in our network notice. And what are they saying about what they've noticed? Nothing yet. Min-jae's voice was precise. But there's a question forming about whether a civilian has access to this house and what that means for security. She's a housekeeper. Yes, sir. The 2 words carried more information than they appeared to. Do-hyun heard it all. If anyone has a security concern, he said, they can bring it to you, and you will tell them that the security situation at this estate is managed by me and doesn't require their input. Of course. Beat. And her specific situation, she's still technically a foreign national without a flight home. Her contract provides for return airfare at termination. She knows this. She does. Min-jae looked at his hands briefly, then back up. Does she know who you are? The question sat in the room. She knows my name, Do-hyun said. Does she know what your name means in Seoul? A long pause. No. Min-jae nodded once, the nod of a man who had his answer and was deciding whether the answer required a follow-up question. He decided it didn't. I'll have the Busan closure document sent over for review. Is there anything else? No. Min-jae picked up his folder and left. Do-hyun sat at his desk and looked at the wall. He had been in this business for 20 years. He had built an empire on the principle that information was the only currency that didn't devalue. He knew, with the part of his brain that didn't take days off, that allowing Zuri Bennett to continue in this house without understanding the environment she was in was a choice that had a cost attached to it. He knew that the cost would eventually come due. He had been in this business long enough to know that debts of this kind came due at the worst possible moment and in the worst possible form. I went to the kitchen at his usual time the next morning and found her there and said nothing about any of it. She had started leaving a cup out for him. He noticed this on day 9 and said nothing about it then either. A plain cup, positioned on the counter near the supplement cabinet. No explanation offered, just there. On day 13, she burned her hand on the kettle. A brief sharp sound and then immediate deliberate silence. The silence of someone who had decided not to make a thing of it. And Do-hyun was halfway across the kitchen before he'd consciously decided to move, rolling fast, and she turned with her hand cradled against her chest, and an expression that was working very hard to be fine. Cold water, he said. I know, there's a first aid kit in the cabinet below the... I'll get it. Zuri. He said her name sharply enough to stop the movement, and she stopped and looked at him, and he reached past her and turned on the cold tap and took her wrist, gently, with the specific gentleness of someone who didn't often use that register, and held her hand under the water. She let him. She stood there and let him hold her hand under cold water without pulling away, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the kitchen was very quiet, and Do-hyun was aware with uncomfortable clarity of the warmth of her wrist in his hand and the way she was breathing, small, controlled breaths, the kind that meant the hand hurt more than she was showing. It's not that bad, she said. I know, he said. Keep it under anyway. She looked at him from the side. He kept his eyes on her hand. You moved fast, she said, just then. The wheelchair's responsive. That's not what I mean. A beat. You leaned forward before you moved, like you were going to... She stopped herself. He felt her wrist shift slightly under his hand. Never mind. He turned off the tap. He went to the cabinet and got the first aid kit and came back and she let him apply the burn dressing, which was a small thing and also wasn't small at all. And when he was done, she looked at the neat bandage on her hand and said quietly, "Thank you, Do-hyun." Not sir, not Mr. Kang. His name, the way she'd tried it the first night, careful with the syllables. He said nothing. He put away the kit. That evening, for the first time, he made it 6 steps down the corridor without touching the wall. His legs were shaking when he sat down. His hands were unsteady. He sat in the dark corridor of his own house and breathed through it, and thought about her saying his name, and thought about Min-jae's careful voice asking, "Does she know what your name means?" And thought about the moment coming. Because it was coming, he was not naive enough to think it wasn't. When she would find out exactly where she was living and exactly who had arranged for her to be here. He thought about what her face would look like when she understood that. He went to bed and lay there for a long time not sleeping, and in the morning he went to the kitchen and she was there, and she had left his cup out and she said good morning without looking up from whatever she was doing, and he said good morning back and the word came out with more texture than he'd intended, and she glanced at him once, briefly, and then away. On day 16 the envelope arrived. It came through Min-jae, which meant it had come through channels that were supposed to be clean, which meant someone with access to those channels had put it there. White envelope, no return address, delivered to Do-hyun's desk with a single typewritten line inside. "We know what's living in your house. Does she?" Do-hyun read it twice. He set it down. He picked up his phone and called Min-jae. "The envelope on my desk," he said when Min-jae answered. Silence. Then, "I was going to brief you this morning. It was in the outer gate delivery yesterday evening. Who has access to the outer gate channel?" "That's what I'm trying to determine." Min-jae's voice had the compressed quality of someone managing several things at once. "Sir, if someone on the outer network has connected the staff hire to your current situation, then this isn't just surveillance. They're running an information probe. They want to know if the woman in your house is leverage." Do-hyun looked at the single-typed sentence. "We know what's living in your house. Does she?" The contempt in it was specific. What's living, not who, what. "Increase the perimeter rotation," he said, quietly. "I don't want her to see the additional security." "And if she asks?" "She won't ask." He thought about this. "But if she does, tell her we're running a routine systems check." "Yes, sir." Min-jae paused. Do-hyun. He rarely used the name without the honorific. It meant he was stepping out of his professional function for a moment. "She's been here 16 days. If someone outside this house is already treating her as a variable in a calculation against you, her situation has changed. She may need to know. I'll handle it." "When?" "When I decide it's time." Silence from Min-jae. The silence of a man who had his own opinion and had weighed whether this was the moment to give it, and had decided no. "Yes, sir," he said. Do-hyun hung up and looked at the envelope for a long time. Outside his window, the pine trees were doing their usual thing with the afternoon light. Somewhere in the West Wing, Zuri Bennett was going about her work with no knowledge that someone in Seoul had just written a sentence describing her as a what rather than a who, and that the sentence had landed on his desk as a warning, and that the warning meant the comfortable in-between space he had been living in for 16 days, where she didn't know and he hadn't told her, and they shared a kitchen in the mornings, and he was learning to walk again in secret, was already over. He just hadn't told her yet. He wheeled to the window and looked at the trees and felt the warmth in his legs that had been building since she arrived, steady and impossible and entirely without explanation, and thought about how many things in his life had seemed manageable right up until the exact moment they weren't. The first shot came through the east window at 11:14 in the evening. Do-hyun heard the glass before he heard the shot, a specific fracturing sound, high and clean, the kind that registers in the body a half-second before the brain catches up, and then the shot itself, and then Min-jae's voice through the earpiece that Do-hyun had been wearing since the envelope arrived 3 days ago, clipped and immediate. "Contact east perimeter. Multiple. Get down. Get down." The lights went out. Not a power failure. A cut. Someone on the outside knew the estate's electrical layout, which meant someone on the outside had access to plans that were supposed to be internal, which meant the envelope had not been a warning. It had been a countdown. Do-hyun was already moving. His wheelchair was in the corner. I was on the floor beside his desk. Not because panic had put him there, but because the floor was the correct tactical position when glass was breaking and the lights were gone, and 20 years in this business had installed certain instincts below the level of conscious thought. He pressed his back against the desk and listened. 4 shots in rapid sequence from the south side. Return fire from his security. He could distinguish his men's weapons by sound, had been able to for years. A shout in Korean from somewhere outside, cut short, the particular silence after a cut-short shout. His phone. He had it in his hand. He called Minjae. Status, he said. 8, maybe 10 on the east and south. They came through the tree line. Minjae was breathing hard and moving. We have 4 down on the perimeter. Cho and Park confirmed. 2 others unknown. Interior team is moving to secondary positions. Zuri. The word came out without the pause he would have expected from himself. Where is she? A half a second too long. West Wing was sealed on my order 20 minutes ago when the motion sensors tripped. She should be in her room. Should be. I have Park Seong moving to confirm. Move faster. Do-hyun pushed himself up from the floor. His legs, the legs that had been learning, secretly, in the dark corridor, held him for 3 seconds before he caught the desk. He grabbed the wheelchair and got into it and moved toward the door. The corridor outside his room was dark except for the emergency strips along the floor, thin red lines that turned the hallway into something from a different kind of nightmare. Do-hyun went fast, faster than he usually moved the chair, the wheels near silent on the hardwood, and he was thinking in the specific compressed way he thought under pressure, not in full sentences but in nodes, prioritized, no noise. And the top node was West Wing and the second node was she doesn't know what this is. He came around the corner toward the central corridor and nearly collided with Park Seong, one of his interior team, a young man from Gwangju who was good under pressure and visibly working to prove it right now. Sir, West Wing, I was just... now. They moved together, the chair and the running man, down the central corridor toward the kitchen junction. The sound of the firefight outside was concentrated on the east and south now. His team was holding, pushing the line back. But holding wasn't the same as resolved, and resolved was the only condition Do-hyun was interested in. They came through the kitchen and into the West Wing service corridor. Zuri was not in her room. The door was open. The light inside was the dim backup strip, enough to show a bed with the covers half pushed back and one shoe on the floor and nothing else. Park Seong looked at Do-hyun. Do-hyun looked at the shoe. Find her, he said. The 2 words came out with a quality that made Park Seong move immediately and without question. She was in the linen storage room 3 doors down, which was either good instinct or luck, or some combination that Do-hyun didn't have time to evaluate. The room had no exterior windows, which was correct. She had the door blocked with a heavy shelf unit she'd moved herself, which was also correct. When Park Seong knocked and identified himself, she didn't immediately open the door, which was, given the circumstances, exactly right. Do-hyun said, Zuri, it's me. A pause. Then the sound of the shelf unit scraping back across the floor. The door opened. She was in the dark in her work clothes, which meant she hadn't been asleep when it started. Her eyes went from Park Seong to Do-hyun, and her face was doing something complicated. Not panic. The panic had clearly already moved through and been managed. But the thing that comes after the first wave of panic, when the body has processed that it's still alive and starts asking questions. What is happening? She said. Flat. No waver. Come with me. That's not... She stopped herself, looked at his face. Whatever she saw there made her step out of the room without finishing the sentence. They moved back through the West Wing, Park Seong ahead and Do-hyun beside her, and the sounds of the firefight continuing outside but shifting, moving, Do-hyun registered, toward the north perimeter, which meant his team was pushing them back, which was good, which was progress. And Zuri walked at his pace without being told to, without commentary, with the specific self-containment of someone who was saving their questions for when the answers could be heard. He took her to the interior safe room off the main residence. Poured concrete, reinforced door, independent air and power. He'd had it built during the estate renovation 7 years ago and never used it. He keyed in the code and the door opened and he said, "In here." She went in. She looked around at the bare concrete room with its 2 cots and its emergency lighting and its steel door and said, "Are you coming in?" "No." "Do-hyun, the door will seal from inside. You'll hear when it's over." He met her eyes. "Don't open it until you hear my voice." She stared at him. Her jaw was set, and her hands were at her sides, and she was frightened. He could see it, had become in the past 3 weeks surprisingly skilled at reading the specific frequencies of her expressions. But the fear was underneath something harder. "What is this?" she said. "This isn't a robbery." "No. These people came here specifically. For you." "Yes." "Who are you?" Not what do you do, not who do you work for. Who are you? Like the answer was a thing she needed to stand on. "I'll explain everything," he said, "when this is done." "Do-hyun, please." The word came out unfamiliar in his own mouth, like a word in a language he hadn't spoken in a long time. "Please go inside." Something moved across her face. She held his gaze for 3 more seconds, counting, he felt certain, deciding. And then she went inside, and he pulled the door and heard the seal engage and turned his chair back toward the corridor and went to find Min-jae. The firefight ended at 12:41 in the morning. 87 minutes. 6 of Do-hyun's men with injuries, 2 of them serious. 4 of the attackers dead on the grounds, 3 captured, the remainder fled north through the tree line into the mountain foothills. Min-jae had the 3 captured men in the garage by 1 o'clock, and Do-hyun arrived to find him standing over them with the expression he wore when the situation required a specific kind of resolution that nobody needed to describe in detail. "Who sent you?" Do-hyun said. He said it in Korean, then repeated it once in the clipped underworld dialect that people in this business used when they wanted to be understood completely. The man on the left was older, more composed. He looked at Do-hyun with the specific assessment of someone calculating whether the answer was more dangerous than the silence. Do-hyun recognized this calculation. He had made it himself once, in a basement in Incheon 12 years ago. "Han," the man said. 1 syllable, a family name. Min-jae looked at Do-hyun. Do-hyun looked at the man and felt something cold and perfectly clear move through him, the way cold moves through water, instantly, completely, without residue. "Han Seo-rin sent you." Not a question. The man's face confirmed it anyway. Han Seo-rin. She had not been a name in Do-hyun's life for almost 2 years. She had been, before that, many things. Fiancé, political arrangement, the human face of an alliance between 2 of Seoul's most entrenched criminal dynasties. She had also been, at the precise moment when Do-hyun's spine was shattered in a basement in Incheon, and his life divided permanently into before and after, entirely absent, not unreachable, not delayed, gone. The engagement had dissolved with the efficiency of something that had never been structural to begin with, just decorative, and Do-hyun had let it dissolve because fighting it would have required energy that he was using simply to stay alive, and because the dissolution confirmed something he had always suspected but not wanted to confirm. He had not thought about her in 14 months. The fact that she had apparently been thinking about him was a specific kind of information. "Get what you need from them," he said to Min-jae, "then handle it." He left the garage and went back through the damaged east corridor. The window boarded now by 2 of the security team, the floor cleared of glass. And to the safe room. He keyed in the exterior release and said, "It's over. You can open the door." The seal clicked. The door opened. Zuri stood in the entrance of the concrete room and looked at him. And the question she'd asked before was still in her face, hadn't gone anywhere, had just been waiting with the patience of something that had decided it would be answered. "Tell me," she said. He told her. Not everything. Not the specific mechanics, not the names of the dead on his side, not the content of what was happening in the garage, but the shape of it. Who he was in Seoul. What the estate represented. What the network was. He used flat language, the same flat language he used in business contexts, because dressing it up would have been its own kind of disrespect, and she had just spent 87 minutes in a sealed concrete room because of who he was, and she deserved the undecorated version. She listened without interrupting. She stood in the doorway of the safe room, and he sat in his chair in the corridor and he talked, and she listened, and her face went through several things that he watched without allowing himself to look away from. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The job posting." "Yes." "You arranged it?" "Yes." "Because you'd been looking for me?" "Yes." She absorbed this. Her hands, he noticed, had come up to cross over her chest. Not defensive exactly, more like she was holding something in place. "The nightclub. You knew who I was before I said my name." "I didn't know your name until after. I ordered a search when you disappeared. A search? She said it the way you repeat a word when you're testing whether it means what you thought it meant. You ran a search for me, with your network. Yes. She looked at the floor, then at the boarded window at the end of the corridor, then back at him. Do-hyun, this house got shot at tonight because of you, because of what you are. Yes. And I've been living here for 3 weeks with no... She stopped, pressed her mouth together. The thing she was holding in place was getting harder to hold. I asked you who you were, twice, in the kitchen. He didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that improved anything. What was I to you, she said, in the beginning, when you arranged for me to be here? What was I? The question had a knife in it. He felt the knife. Someone I wanted to find, he said. That's not an answer. It's the true one. She stared at him. Her eyes were bright and steady, and he could see the anger in them, but he could also see something working behind the anger, something that was still thinking even while she was furious, which was, he registered this even now, one of the things about her that he had never encountered in anyone else in his life. The dancing, she said, at Mirage. Did you fake? No. The word came out hard and immediate, and he felt the hardness of it, the involuntary force behind it. No. What happened that night was not arranged. What happened in this house? He stopped, found the right words, not the easy words. My legs are different since you've been here. I don't have an explanation. I don't have one, and I've stopped pretending I'm going to find one. She looked at him for a long time. Something shifted in her face. Not softening, not forgiving, just a change in the quality of the calculation. Your legs, she said slowly. I've been practicing at night, in the corridor, standing, walking. He said it the same way he said everything hard, without performance, without apology. 6 steps 2 nights ago, without the wall. She sat down on the floor, just sat down, right there in the doorway of the safe room, which was not a thing he expected, and put her face in her hands for a moment, and then dropped her hands and looked at him from the floor and said, I don't know what to do with any of this. I know. You lied to me, by omission, yes. That's still... She stopped. That's still a lie, Do-hyun. Yes, he said. It is. Outside, he could hear his security team moving through the grounds, the sounds of cleanup and reorganization, the aftermath machinery of a life that had just been made visible to her in the worst possible way. He let her sit. He didn't try to move the conversation toward a resolution it hadn't earned yet. She said finally from the floor, the people who attacked tonight, a rival family, connected to someone specific. Yes. Who? He considered this for a moment. He had been going to keep it separate, her situation, the Han matter, because they were still, technically, 2 different problems. He understood in this moment that they had never been 2 different problems. They had been 1 problem in 2 expressions, and he had been managing them separately out of a habit of compartmentalization that this night had just permanently broken. Han Seo-rin, he said, a woman I was engaged to before the injury. Her family controlled significant territory in the northeast. She ended the engagement after Incheon. I didn't contest it. Zuri's expression shifted. She ended it because you were hurt. She ended it because I was no longer useful, he said, which is a more accurate description. And now she sent people with guns. Now she wants the engagement reinstated. The attack was a demonstration of what the alternative looks like. He watched her face. I had been informed of her intentions. I had not anticipated the timeline. Zuri looked at him with an expression that contained several things in careful tension. She knows about me, she said. It wasn't a question. Someone told her there was a foreign woman living here. Yes. So She stopped. Her jaw tightened. I'm the reason she moved up the timeline. You're not responsible for... That's not what I said. Her voice had an edge in it now, clear and sharp. I said, I'm the reason. That's just cause and effect. I'm not saying it's my fault. I'm saying it's what happened. He looked at her on the floor of his corridor and felt something that was very old and very specific. The feeling of being accurately seen by someone who was also in the process of deciding whether you were worth the cost of seeing clearly. She stood up. Not with drama, just stood, brushed nothing off her clothes because there was nothing on them, and looked at him. I'm not leaving tonight, she said. He hadn't expected that. He didn't show it, but he hadn't. Zuri, I'll decide what I'm doing in the morning, when I can think. She looked at the boarded window, then back at him. Is the house secure right now? Yes. Are your men handling what needs handling? Yes. Okay. She looked at him for a moment longer with that specific quality of assessment, the thing that had seen him from a dance floor and decided he looked like somebody who used to dance. Go do what you need to do tonight. I'll see you in the morning. She turned and walked back toward the west wing. He watched her go. She didn't look back. He stayed in the corridor for a moment after she turned the corner, alone with the emergency lighting and the sounds of his security team working outside, and felt the warmth in his legs that had been constant for 3 weeks, steady as something structural, and thought about Han Seorin and the word reinstated and the word leverage, and the fact that the morning was only a few hours away, and the morning was going to require him to make a choice that he had been deferring with the specific desperation of someone who knows the choice is coming and cannot yet fully see it. The choice arrived before morning. At 4:17, Min-jae sent a single message to Do-hyun's phone. She's here. Do-hyun read it twice, put the phone down, picked it up again. Wrote back, front gate or contact? Min-jae's response, front gate. Car. She came herself. Do-hyun looked at the ceiling of his bedroom. He had not slept. He had been sitting at his window watching the ground since 2 o'clock, the way he sometimes sat when a situation was resolving itself and needed to be watched, rather than managed. He had been thinking about what Zuri had said, I'll decide what I'm doing in the morning, and about what morning was going to look like, and about 6 steps in the corridor and about the word reinstated. He wrote, send her to the main receiving room. I'll be there in 5 minutes. He was there in 3. Han Seorin was not what people expected when they imagined a woman whose family ran organized crime across 3 northeastern provinces. She was small and precisely put together, in her mid-30s, with the specific physical composure of someone who had been trained from childhood to present nothing on the surface. She was wearing a coat that was expensive without announcing it, and her hair was perfect, and she stood in the center of Do-hyun's main receiving room at 4 in the morning, looking as if she had arrived for a scheduled appointment. She looked at him when he wheeled in. Her expression moved through something very briefly. Not guilt. Han Seorin did not deal in guilt. And settled. Do-hyun, she said. You sent men to my house, he said. I sent a message. She tilted her head slightly. The men were the medium. 2 of my people are in hospital. And 4 of mine are dead on your grounds. She said it without heat, a ledger entry. The message was mutual. He stopped his chair in the center of the room. They were 6 feet apart. He had known this woman for 9 years, been formally engaged to her for 3 of those years, and he understood her the way you understood a system you'd spent a long time inside. Not with warmth, but with precision. What do you want? He said. Not opening, just efficiency. The same thing I've wanted since March. She set her clutch on the side table and clasped her hands in front of her, a gesture that was composed and also, he knew, performed composure. The alliance, the merger, our families together in the formal structure that was arranged before Incheon, he said. She didn't flinch. Yes. You ended it after Incheon. Circumstances were uncertain. I was in a wheelchair, he said. That was the circumstance. Something moved in her face, a brief tightening. The situation has evolved, meaning I can walk now, or am walking again, or that you've heard something to that effect and recalculated. He watched her. Which is it? Her eyes moved, a small, precise movement toward the corridor. Well, I heard there was a foreign woman living here. She's staff. She's American. Seorin's voice remained level, but something underneath it had gone sharp. She's black and she's American and she's been living in your personal residence for 3 weeks. And the day she arrived is, by a remarkable coincidence, the day that our intelligence started picking up changes in your physical activity. Silence. The room's furniture was very still. She's staff, he said again. Don't. The word came out with considerably more force than her composure had been suggesting was available. She caught it, smoothed it back down, but the smoothing was visible this time. I came here personally at 4 in the morning. I am prepared to offer the full weight of my family's support, the Northern Territory consolidation, the Incheon port arrangement. Everything that was on the table in 2021, plus 2 years of interest. Because you are useful again, and because what we could build together is worth more than whatever. She stopped. Whatever this is. Whatever this is, Do-hyun repeated. She is a tourist, Seo-rin said, and the word tourist came out with a quality that was precisely and deliberately reductive. She is a civilian from another country who wandered into your life by accident and will go home. I am a structural reality. The arrangement between our families is a structural reality. You cannot replace infrastructure with... Don't finish that sentence, Do-hyun said. She finished it anyway. With sentiment. The words sat in the room. Seo-rin looked at him with the careful eyes of someone who had made a calculated move and was watching to see if the board responded correctly. Do-hyun looked back at her and felt nothing warm. He felt instead the cold, precise thing that had kept him operational for 20 years, and underneath it, new and structural and entirely non-negotiable, something else. I'm going to need you to leave my house, he said. Seo-rin's composure didn't crack, but something behind it went very still, the stillness of a calculation that has returned an unexpected result. Do-hyun, think. I've thought. He turned his chair toward the door and then stopped and looked back at her. The engagement is finished. The alliance is finished. Tell your family the answer is no, and that if there's a second message of the kind delivered tonight, the response will be different. Her eyes were very steady. You're choosing her. I'm choosing myself, he said. She happens to be part of what that looks like. He left the room. He went down the corridor. He heard distantly the sound of Seo-rin's heels crossing the receiving room floor toward the exit, precise and unhurried, the walk of a woman who had not finished and intended everyone to know it. He went to the kitchen. Zuri was there. Of course she was. She was sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of tea she'd clearly made an hour ago and forgotten, her hands wrapped around it for the warmth. And she looked up when he came in, and her face said she had heard enough. How much? He said. The part about me being a tourist, she said, and the part where she called me sentiment. A pause. And the part where you told her no. He looked at her hands around the cold cup. I meant it. I know. She looked at him steadily. She's not going to stop. No, he said. She's not. What does that mean for... She gestured, a small comprehensive motion that meant all of this, the kitchen, the estate, whatever was happening between them in the mornings. What does that mean? It means the next thing she sends won't be a demonstration, he said. It'll be a conclusion. Zuri set down the cup. She pressed her palms flat on the island counter and looked at them for a moment and then looked up. Show me, she said. He looked at her. What? The walking. Her eyes were direct and entirely serious. Show me what you've been doing at night. Something moved through him, exposed and resistant, and also, below both of those, something that wanted this badly enough to override the resistance. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hands on the armrests and stood. She didn't gasp. She didn't produce tears or exclamations or any of the things the moment seemed to be configured to produce. She watched him stand in her kitchen at 4:30 in the morning with an expression that was precise and intent and something else he couldn't name, something that looked, when he tried to find a word for it, a great deal like faith. He stood for 41 seconds. He counted them because counting was what his brain did when his body was doing something it didn't have language for yet. 41 seconds in the kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, upright, with Zuri Bennett watching him from the other side of the island, with her palms flat on the counter and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was thinking hard and feeling harder and refusing to confuse the two. Then his legs gave and he sat back down, and the wheelchair took his weight, and he breathed. She said nothing for a moment, then, "How long have you been doing this?" 3 weeks, he said. "Since you arrived." She looked at her hands on the counter. Do-hyun, I know. That's not... She stopped, started again. That's not a small thing. No. She looked up. Her eyes were bright. Bright, and the brightness wasn't tears. It was something more like the specific alertness of someone who has just understood the full dimensions of a problem and is already working on it. She's going to come back. Yes. With more. Yes. She nodded once, slowly. The nod of someone who has made a decision in the space between one breath and the next. Then we need to be ready, she said. Both of us. He looked at her across the kitchen island at 4:30 in the morning, 3 weeks after a nightclub and a dance and an impossible thing happening to his body, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for 12 years. Not peace exactly. Something more like resolve. The feeling of a man who has decided to stop managing his losses and start choosing what he fights for. Go sleep, he said. We'll talk in the morning. It is morning. More morning, then. She almost smiled. She picked up the cold tea and looked at it and put it in the sink and walked past him toward the west wing. At the corridor entrance, she stopped and looked back. 6 steps, she said. Yes. You'll get more. She went. He sat in the kitchen alone until the sky outside the window started doing something gray and slow and tentative, and then he went to the corridor and stood up and walked, in the dark, 8 steps before the wall became necessary. He did not tell Min-jae about the 8 steps. Min-jae had enough to manage. The next 4 days were the specific kind of quiet that Do-hyun had learned over 20 years to mistrust completely, the kind that arrived after a first strike and before the second, while both sides recalibrated. His perimeter was reinforced, 6 additional men, rotating in 12-hour shifts. The tree line on the north side cleared to improve sightlines. Min-jae ran his intelligence network hard, pulling reports from every contact in the Han orbit, and the reports came back with a consistency that told its own story. Seorin had not gone home and regrouped. Seorin had made calls. Seorin had activated resources that required the kind of activation that wasn't casual. She's going formal, Min-jae told him on the 3rd morning. She's called in the Jeolla connection. The Park Hwang syndicate owes her father a debt from 2019, and she's collecting. Do-hyun was at his desk. He had slept 4 hours. How much of the debt? Enough to bring 15-20 additional men, and their equipment isn't small arms. Min-jae set his folder on the desk. She's planning something that ends it, not a demonstration this time. Timeline. Unknown. 72 hours is my best estimate, based on travel and coordination. Could be less. He looked at Do-hyun steadily. She's going to try to take the estate. And Zuri. If she can use her, yes. Min-jae's voice was even. If she can't, she'll use her differently. The word differently sat in the room doing what it was designed to do. I want Zuri out, Do-hyun said, before this moves. Min-jae nodded. I can arrange. She won't go. A pause. Sir? I'm telling you in advance, so we don't waste time on it. He looked at his desk. I'll talk to her. She'll tell me she's staying. I need a contingency for that. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. In 14 years, Do-hyun had never heard him say anything that could be construed as sentimental, and he didn't now. He said, I'll build the contingency, but try anyway. Do-hyun tried. He found her in the east corridor after lunch. She'd been rehanging a tapestry that had come off its brackets during the shooting, with the practical focus of someone who found it easier to fix visible things than invisible ones. And he said her name, and she turned and looked at his face and said, No. You don't know what I'm going to say. You're going to ask me to leave. She turned back to the tapestry. No. Zuri, what's coming is not what came before. I know that. If they take this estate, then we don't let them take it. She adjusted the tapestry's upper bracket with a firmness that indicated the conversation was ongoing, but her position wasn't. I'm not leaving you here. That's not a thing I'm able to do. I'm asking you to. She turned to look at him fully. Her expression was not soft. It was the expression of someone who had thought about this longer than this conversation. You've been standing up in the dark for 3 weeks, she said, by yourself, practicing. Her voice had something in it, not pity, the opposite of pity. I'm not leaving you to handle whatever's coming from a wheelchair because it's safer for me. That's not how I'm built. He looked at her. He had run organizations of 60, 70 people who followed his instructions without question, and he looked at this woman who had known him for less than a month and felt with complete clarity that he was not going to win this argument. He wasn't sure he wanted to. If it gets bad, he said, you go to the safe room and you stay. If it gets bad, she said, I'll do what makes sense. It wasn't the agreement he'd asked for. He took it anyway. On the 4th day, Min-jae's phone rang at 6 in the evening, and the expression that crossed his face when he answered was the expression Do-hyun had seen on him twice in 14 years, both times before something that required significant resources to survive. He looked at Do-hyun when he hung up and said, "Tonight." One word. Do-hyun heard everything in it. "How many?" he said. 23 confirmed, possibly more. They're staging in the commercial district east of the mountain, a warehouse, 2 vehicles. Our contact inside got one message out before he went dark." Min Jae's hands were at his sides, perfectly still, which was its own kind of urgency. "They have a vehicle that can breach the main gate, and they're not planning for a firefight. They're planning for a siege and extraction." Extraction, not raid. Extraction meant they were coming for something specific. "She's the target," Do-hyun said. "She's the leverage," Min Jae said. "You're the target." Do-hyun sat with this for exactly 3 seconds. 23 men, a gate-breaching vehicle, and a woman named Han Seo-rin who had decided that the way to resolve this equation was to remove the variable she couldn't calculate for. He called Min Jae's full team into the main room at 6:15. 14 men, spread around the table and the walls, faces with the specific quality of men who had been in this work long enough to have one setting for situations like this. He looked at them and did not make a speech. He laid out the disposition, who covered which position, what the escalation threshold was, what protected and what was expendable, and then he said, "The woman stays safe. That is the absolute priority. Above territory, above the estate, above any other objective tonight, she stays safe." Nobody in the room questioned this. Min Jae had already made certain they understood the stakes. At 7, he went to find Zuri. She was in the kitchen, which had become, he realized, the room where everything important between them happened, making food with the focused efficiency of someone who cooked when they needed to keep their hands busy. She heard his chair and didn't look up immediately, finished what she was doing, then turned. She saw his face. "Tonight," she said. "Yes." She set down what she was holding, looked at him for a moment. "What do you need me to do?" "Not what's happening, not are we going to be okay. What do you need me to do?" He absorbed this, the specific grammar of it, the way it positioned her, and felt something move through his chest that he had no appropriate name for. "Stay close to Minji when it's," he said. "He'll have a position near the central corridor. If I tell you to go to the safe room, I'll assess the situation and decide," she said. "Zuri, that's what I can actually promise." Her eyes were direct, and the directness wasn't obstinate, it was honest. "I won't run from something I can help with. That's just who I am." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "I know who you are." The words came out with more weight than he'd intended. She heard the weight. Her expression shifted, something opening briefly behind it, something that had been waiting for precisely those words. And then she pulled it back into composure and nodded. "Be careful," she said. "I'm always careful." "No," she said. "You're always strategic. That's different. Tonight, be careful." He left the kitchen. I went to his room and sat by the window in the last of the evening light and did the thing he did before situations that required full capacity. Cleared the architecture, ran the variables, accepted the outcomes he couldn't control, and set them aside. He had done this before 60 confrontations over 20 years. He had never done it while thinking about someone else's safety with this specific quality of thinking, this weight. He stood up from the chair. He stood in his bedroom, without the wall and without the armrests, and breathed through the instability in his legs and stood. 30 seconds. 40. His thighs were shaking. He stood anyway. Then he sat back down and waited for the night. They came at 9:47, not from the east this time. The gate breach vehicle came from the south, a reinforced truck that took the main gate's lock assembly off in one impact and kept moving, and the men came in behind it on foot through both flanks simultaneously, which told Do-hyun that whoever was running their tactical side had studied the first assault's failure and adjusted. They'd identified the east bias in his perimeter and deliberately avoided it, splitting the entry to divide his team's response. He heard the gate go from his position in the central corridor. His earpiece immediately filled with Min Jae's voice. "South breach moving. East flank contact. Do-hyun, stay interior." "Where is she?" "With Park Seong, Central Junction. Sir." Gunfire. Close. The south side security team engaging the breach vehicle before it reached the main residence. Do-hyun sat in the corridor with his hands on his armrests and listened to his teamwork and counted contact points from the sound, and ran the geometry of it in his head, and understood within 90 seconds that they were outnumbered and the positioning was bad. Not catastrophic, but bad. The corridor lights died. Backup strips came on, the same red lines as before. Do-hyun moved toward the central junction and found Park Seong and Zuri at the corner near the kitchen entrance. Park Seong had his weapon out and his back to the wall and his eyes moving in the practiced pattern of someone covering an approach. Zuri was behind him, not cowering, standing, watching the corridor, tracking. She saw Do-hyun, and for 1 second her composure ran a brief, honest calculation of his face. "How bad?" she said. "Manageable," he said. She knew from his voice that he meant something more nuanced than the word. From outside, 3 rapid shots, then silence. Then Min-jae, "We've lost the south position. They're inside the outer wall." Not inside the residence, inside the estate grounds. There was a distinction, and the distinction was about 90 seconds of running at full speed. "West approach is clear," Min-jae continued. "I need 2 more men on the north interior or they cut through the garden. Do-hyun, the truck is stopped, but the personnel—" An explosion. Not large, not structural, but close enough that the corridor walls moved slightly, a brief shudder through the whole building, and Zuri put her hand flat against the wall beside her without thinking, and Park Seong dropped to a knee with his weapon up. "Breaching charge," Do-hyun said. "East side secondary door." Min-jae's voice strained now, moving. "Confirmed. They're splitting entry. 3 at the east secondary, main force still south." A pause filled with sound. Do-hyun. "The east secondary leads to the— I know where it leads." He turned his chair toward the east corridor. Park Seong moved immediately to block him. "Sir, you can't move. The tactical position is interior. We need you." Park Seong. The name, flat and absolute. The man moved. Do-hyun went to the east corridor. He could hear them through the door before he reached it. The sounds of 3 men working a breach, controlled and fast, not amateurs. The door was heavy and reinforced and would hold for another 40, maybe 50 seconds. He stopped in front of it. He sat in his chair in the emergency lighting and looked at the door and listened to what was on the other side of it and ran the calculation 1 more time, the way he always ran calculations, completely, without sentiment, including all variables. The variable he kept arriving at was this: if they came through that door and found him in a wheelchair, they would know exactly how to use that information. And Seorin, who was somewhere outside this building running this assault from a position of deliberate safety, would have what she needed. He reached down and locked the wheelchair. He put his hands on the armrests. Behind him, he heard Zuri's footsteps. She'd followed, of course. Park Seong probably hadn't been able to stop her. And then she was at the corridor entrance and she said, "Do-hyun, don't." He looked back at her. Her face in the red emergency light was completely clear, completely present, not afraid for herself but for him. And the fear was the specific fear of someone who understood what he was about to try to do and knew what it would cost his body. "Stay there," he said. "You can't hold a door," she said, her voice sharp. "That's not a plan. That's—" "I know." He turned back to the door. The breaching sounds had changed. They were through the first layer. 15 seconds, maybe 20, on the second. "I'm not holding the door." She was quiet for a second. He heard her breath. "Then what are you doing?" she said. He put his weight forward on the armrests. He felt his legs, the warmth in them, the presence, the thing that had been building for 3 weeks like a tide coming in. And he pushed. He stood. Not smoothly, not without cost. His legs were shaking and his breath came in hard, and there was something in his lower back that was sending signals his brain had learned to work through rather than respond to. And he stood, fully upright, in the corridor, in front of a door that was 30 seconds from coming open. He heard Zuri make a sound, small and involuntary and immediately controlled. He took 1 step, then another. His hand went to the corridor wall for 1 step, and then left it, and he was walking. Not well, not steadily, not anything that a physical therapist would call acceptable form, but moving under his own power, in his own building, toward a door through which men were coming to use him against himself. He reached the wall panel beside the door, the override panel. Every reinforced door in the estate had one, keyed to his biometric. He pressed his palm flat against the reader. The door's internal locking system activated. Not just the standard locks, The full siege protocol, the one Minji had installed 2 years ago that was designed to make the door structurally inseparable from the wall for a minimum of 6 hours without specialized cutting equipment. The sounds on the other side changed. Someone hit the door with force. Then again. Then a muffled voice in Korean, frustrated and recalibrating. Do-hyun put his back against the wall and breathed. His legs were doing something that was partly pain and partly the specific exhaustion of muscles that had been asked to work beyond their current capacity, and he pressed the back of his head against the wall and closed his eyes for 3 seconds. Do-hyun. Zuri's voice directly in front of him, close. He opened his eyes. She was standing 2 feet away. She had crossed the corridor. Her eyes were moving over him in the rapid professional assessment of someone checking for damage, and then they came to rest on his face. You walked, she said, low, just for the corridor. Don't make it significant right now. It is significant. Later. He looked at her. Is Park Seong? He's behind me. She reached out and put her hand against his chest. Not to steady him, not a gesture of help, just contact. Just her hand there. Your team? Minjae has the south. The north interior was thin. He pushed himself off the wall. His legs held. I need to get to the command position. Then let's go. She dropped her hand and turned, and he followed her, and Park Seong fell in behind them, and they moved through the red-lit corridors of the estate toward the center, while outside the sounds of the fight continued. Gunfire in bursts, shouted coordinates, the specific brutal arithmetic of his team against Seorin's. Minjae's voice in his ear. Do-hyun, we're holding north interior. South is contested. I have 6 men, and they have a burst of fire, close to Minjae's position. Considerably more. If you have something in reserve, I would recommend deploying it approximately now. On my way, Do-hyun said. You need to be in the... I said on my way. They reached the main interior hub, a reinforced alcove off the main residence hall that served as the command position during estate defense. 2 monitors showing external feeds, a weapons locker, a direct line to the security team frequency. Do-hyun went to the monitors. The south grounds were chaos, but structured chaos. His team in 3 positions, Seorin's men trying to collapse the triangle and failing. The north interior showed 2 of his men holding a corridor against a 4-man push. It was sustainable for maybe 4 more minutes. He looked at the feed. He looked at the layout he had memorized 7 years ago when he bought this estate and drilled twice a year since. He found the variable Seorin's people hadn't accounted for. The utility approach from the north garden, the service corridor that ran under the kitchen and connected to the south position. His men didn't know about it. Seorin's men definitely didn't know about it. He turned to Park Seong. The utility approach. Take Lee and Kim if you have them. Come up behind the south position. They don't know that corridor exists. Park Seong stared at him for half a second, the half-second of a man confirming he'd heard correctly, and then moved. Do-hyun turned back to the monitors. Zuri was beside him, not touching, close. He could feel her attention on the screens. What's the south feed showing? She said. They're trying to flank left. He pointed. See the movement there? 3 men, north edge of the garden wall. They're going to try to cut the south position from the side. Can your men see them? Not from where they are. He opened the frequency. Jung, left flank. 3 men, north edge of the garden wall. 20 seconds. A burst of static. Then, copy. The 3 men on the feed stopped moving. 2 of them went down. The 3rd retreated into the darkness of the garden. Zuri exhaled, the smallest sound. Good, she said. It wasn't directed at him specifically, just a response to the fact of it, the way you respond to something when you've been watching it and holding your breath. He looked at her profile in the monitor light. She was watching the feeds with the focused intensity of someone who had decided to be useful and was figuring out how. Her jaw was set and her eyes were moving between the screens, and her hand was on the edge of the console, not gripping it, just resting there, the hand of someone staying calm on purpose. He turned back to the monitors. Minjae's position on the south was stabilizing. Park Seong's team hitting the flank from the utility approach, the element of surprise buying them exactly the advantage it had been designed to buy. The north interior was still contested, 3 minutes from critical if nothing changed. He opened the frequency for the north team, gave them the repositioning instruction, pull back 20 meters, consolidate, draw the attackers into the corridor junction where the angles worked in his team's favor. Standard tactical principle. His North team lead, a man named Bae, who had been with him for 6 years, confirmed and moved. 3 minutes passed. They felt like a different unit of time than regular minutes. Then Bae's voice. North is clear. 4 of theirs down, 2 retreating through the garden. Minjae, south. South is pushing them back. They're losing coordination. The feeds confirmed it. Seorin's assault, which had been designed to overwhelm through numbers and simultaneous pressure, was fragmenting at the joints. 23 men was a significant force if the pressure stayed coherent. When the coherence broke, it became a different kind of problem for the people in the majority. Do-hyun watched the monitors and breathed and said nothing. Zuri said quietly, "She's pulling them back." He looked at the south feed. She was right. The movement pattern had changed, no longer pushing, consolidating toward the south breach point, retreating. "She's pulling back," he confirmed. Into the frequency. Minjae. "I see it." Minjae sounded like a man who had been running and fighting for the last 40 minutes and was managing that on top of everything else. "They're going for the breach point. Do you want pursuit?" "No, let them leave." He watched the feeds. "Document what you can. Plates, faces if the cameras caught them." Already on it. The south feed showed the last of Seorin's men moving through the damaged gate. The ground settled into the specific silence of somewhere that has just stopped being a battlefield and hasn't fully decided what it is now. Do-hyun stood in the command position, standing, not in the chair, which was still in the east corridor where he'd left it, with Zuri beside him, and watched his estate become quiet. His legs were shaking badly. Had been for the last 20 minutes. He had been managing it through the operation by keeping the weight distributed and his back against the console, and he could continue managing it for approximately 2 more minutes before management would no longer be an option. Zuri saw it. He knew she saw it because she shifted slightly without drawing attention to it, positioning herself close enough that if he needed to use her as support, he could without making it a thing. He didn't use her. Not yet. Minji came through the door at the corridor and end, rumpled, a cut above his left eye that had bled and dried, jacket gone. He looked at Do-hyun and looked at the wheelchairless corridor and looked at Do-hyun's legs and then at his face. "Casualties," Do-hyun said. Minjae pulled his focus back with the efficiency of long practice. "2 of ours injured, neither critical. Lee has a through and through on the right arm. Cho has a concussion from the breaching charge proximity. Their people, 4 confirmed down on the grounds. 2 captured before the retreat." He paused. "And 1 vehicle with identifiable plates. Get everything to the intelligence team tonight." "Already." Minjae stopped. His eyes moved back to Do-hyun's stance. The standing. The legs that were clearly working beyond their comfortable range. "Sir, don't." "I'm not saying anything." "Good." Minjae nodded. He turned to give Park Seong instructions. Do-hyun used the 3 seconds of redirected attention to put his hand flat on the console and take the weight off his right leg for a moment, and Zuri, without looking at him, without acknowledging it, simply stayed where she was, close, available. The shaking was getting worse. "I need a minute," he said to the room, which meant to her. She looked at him. Not with alarm, just assessment. "Okay," she said. He made it to the door of the command position, past it, into the main residence hall, to the wall. He put both hands against it and stood there with his forehead almost touching the plaster and breathed through the trembling in his legs, the fire in his lower back, the specific accumulated cost of standing and walking and standing again for 40 minutes, while his body was still, by every medical measure, not supposed to be capable of any of it. She was there. He didn't hear her come in, but she was there. Not touching, not speaking, just present in the way she'd been present from the beginning. Not accommodating, not hovering, just there. He breathed. "She'll come back," he said to the wall. "Seorin. She lost men tonight. That means she's spent capital. It also means she can't afford to lose, and the next move will be everything she has left." "I know," Zuri said. "She'll come for you specifically, to use against me." He turned from the wall and looked at her. His legs were still shaking. His face was doing whatever it was doing. He had no control over it, which was unusual. "I can't protect you indefinitely from inside this estate. The estate is a fixed position, and she knows its layout now." So we don't stay fixed, Zuri said. He looked at her. You said she'll come with everything she has, Zuri continued. Her voice was steady and practical, the voice of someone working a problem. So don't be here when she does. Find where she's positioned. Go to her. Take the offense. Stop waiting for the next hit and hit first. She held his gaze. You know where she'll be. You have people who can find it. Stop defending ground that she's already decided to take, and go take hers, he said. The words landed between them, and both of them understood what they meant. Not just tactically, but completely. The full weight of choosing offense over defense, aggression over protection, the choice that stopped being a choice and started being the only door left in the room. His legs stopped shaking. He noticed this. They simply stopped. The warmth in them went from trembling to steady in the space of 10 seconds, and he stood in the main hall of his estate with Zuri Bennett 3 feet away and felt his body arrive at something it had not been in 12 years. Ready. I need Minjai, he said. I'll get him. She turned, stopped, looked back. Do-hyun. He looked at her. Her mouth did something complicated. Then she said simply and clearly, I'm not leaving. Whatever you're planning, I'm not leaving. He looked at her for a long moment in the corridor light. Then he said, I know. And he meant it the way you mean something when you've stopped pretending you didn't already know. Minjae took 40 minutes to locate Seorin's position. Not 40 minutes of searching, 40 minutes of confirming what 3 separate intelligence contacts had already suggested, because in this business confirmation was the difference between a good decision and a final one. She was in a private facility in Mapogu, a converted warehouse that her family had been using as a secondary operations center for 2 years. Do-hyun's network had the address, but had never acted on it because there had never been sufficient cause. Seorin had, across 3 nights and 1 conversation at 4 in the morning, provided sufficient cause. Do-hyun spent the remaining dark hours before dawn in the operations room with Minjae and 4 senior men working through the approach. No speeches, no declarations. Just the clean, hard geometry of a problem that needed solving before it came back with more resources and less restraint. He stood at the planning table for most of it, stood on his own legs, with occasional contact with the table's edge. And nobody in the room commented on this because Minjae had established prior to the meeting that no one would, and Minjae's prior establishments had the quality of geological fact. Zuri stayed in the room. She didn't participate in the planning, didn't offer tactical input. She sat in the chair nearest the door and watched and said nothing, which was its own kind of presence. The presence of someone who had decided that witnessing was the most honest thing she could offer right now, and offered it fully. At one point, Minjae glanced at her and then at Do-hyun, a question in the glance. Do-hyun returned a look that answered it. Minjae went back to the map. They moved at first light. 12 men, 3 vehicles, with Do-hyun in the second car and the wheelchair folded in the back. Because he was not yet at the point where he could guarantee his legs for an extended operation, and he understood this about himself without shame. Practicality was not the same as defeat. He had learned this in a basement in Incheon 12 years ago, and had been learning it every day since in ways that had become, finally, useful. Zuri was in the second car with him. He had not told her she couldn't come. He had spent 45 seconds considering it, and then understood that the argument would cost time he didn't have and ground he didn't need to lose, and that she was safer in a controlled operation than left at an estate that had already been breached twice. Minjae, in the front seat, had said nothing when she got into the vehicle. Another geological fact, accepted and moved past. The drive was 23 minutes. Do-hyun spent most of it looking at the city coming awake outside the window, the street vendors setting up, the early commuters, the specific gray-gold light of Seoul at 6 in the morning that he had watched from windows for years without going into it, and which looked different now in a way he had no precise language for. Zuri was beside him. She was looking at the city too. Her hands were in her lap and she was very quiet, and he could see the slight tension in her jaw that meant she was managing something, and he reached over, without thinking, without the kind of prior deliberation he usually applied to physical contact, and covered her hands with one of his. She looked down at his hand, then up at his face. She turned one hand over and held his. Neither of them said anything. The city moved past the windows. The Mapo facility was a large rectangular structure in a block of similar buildings, the kind of neighborhood that looked industrial from outside and housed any number of things that didn't advertise themselves. Do-hyun's team had eyes on it from 2 positions before the vehicles arrived, and the report was consistent: 18 men visible, another 4 to 6 estimated inside, and Seorin herself confirmed on site by a contact who had done the confirmation at considerable personal risk. 18 men and a woman who had committed to this. The math was not comfortable. Do-hyun had never operated on comfortable math. Comfortable math was for businesses that could afford to wait for better conditions. His conditions were what they were. "She'll have a position inside that doesn't see the approaches," he said to Min-jae in the vehicle. "Central room, probably. She'll have exits planned. We have the north and west covered." Min-jae was checking his phone. "Team 2 is on the east. There's a south loading dock. Older structure, not on the building permit. Our contact confirmed it's active. She knows about it. Almost certainly. Put 2 men on it, but don't seal it." He looked at Min-jae. "She needs to think she has a way out. If she doesn't think she has an exit, she fights until she can't." Min-jae nodded once. This was old logic, proven logic, the kind that had made Do-hyun effective for 20 years, the kind that required you to understand what the other person needed to believe. "When it starts," Min-jae said carefully, "your position should be—" "I'll tell you my position when we're on the ground." Another nod. Careful, deliberate, the nod of a man who had made his peace with the fact that some arguments were not available to him. They deployed at 6:41. Do-hyun came out of the vehicle and stood, on the street, with the morning air on his face and his legs under him, and his team moving into position with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this before. He felt the ground through his shoes, a specific plain sensation, pavement, slightly uneven, the faint vibration of the city operating at low frequency, that he had not felt in 12 years and felt now with a clarity that went through his whole body. He left the wheelchair in the car. Min-jae saw this, came to stand beside him, said nothing. Then, "Stay mobile. If the legs, I'll manage." "I know you'll manage. I'm saying stay mobile so you have options." He looked at Min-jae. The man had a cut above his eye from last night that someone had taped together with medical tape, and his jacket was borrowed from one of the team, slightly too large in the shoulders. And he had the look of a man who had been awake for 22 hours managing crisis after crisis with the steady reliability of infrastructure. Do-hyun had known him for 14 years and had, in all that time, never said some of the things that were true about that. "Min-jae," he said. "Sir." After this, he looked at the building. "We're going to talk about a transition." A pause. "Sir?" "Not today. After." He looked at him. "You've been doing 2 jobs for 6 years. It's time you did yours." Min-jae looked at him for a moment with an expression that moved through several things and arrived at something that was, for a man who didn't deal in sentiment, surprisingly close to it. "Yes, sir," he said. "After." They moved. The facility's outer security was good, but configured for the previous threat assessment, defense against an outside raid, not a structured approach by a team that had studied the building. Do-hyun's men cleared the outer positions in 4 minutes with noise suppression and positioning that minimized engagement time. By the time anyone inside the facility understood the geometry of what was happening to them, the perimeter was already closed. Do-hyun entered through the west access point with Min-jae and 3 men. His legs were working, not smoothly, not with the ease they'd had 12 years ago, but working, holding his weight, responding to his intentions, carrying him through the industrial interior of the facility with its concrete floors and high ceilings, and the smell of a building that housed things it didn't want documented. The interior team deployed toward them from the center. 7 men, moving fast, the advance guard of a facility that had just understood it was compromised. Do-hyun's team handled them in the corridor with the efficiency of people who had studied the floor plan, and the advancing men hadn't. It was loud for 90 seconds, and then it wasn't. Do-hyun kept moving toward the center. There were 2 more rooms between the exterior and the interior suite where Seorin's contact had confirmed her position. The first room was empty. Cleared already? Someone had moved. The second room had 3 men and a woman who was not Seorin, and who, when Min-jae's team came through the door, made a decision that told Do-hyun that Seorin's loyalty structure was thinner than her organizational chart suggested. She gave them the interior suite location. Voluntarily, in under a minute. Min-jae looked at Do-hyun. Do-hyun nodded. They moved. The interior suite was at the building's center, a room that had been fitted for planning sessions and secure communication, with the kind of equipment that represented significant investment and the kind of investment that told you how seriously someone had been preparing. Seo-rin was there. 2 men with her, positioned, weapons raised when the door came open. Do-hyun came through the door standing. Whatever Seo-rin had prepared herself to see, whatever her intelligence had told her about the current state of Kang Do-hyun, it had not prepared her for this specific image. A man she had left 12 years ago in a wheelchair, standing in the doorway of her operations center with the specific stillness of someone who has already decided how this ends and is offering the other person a chance to arrive at the same conclusion. Her composure held. I gave her credit for that. The composure held for approximately 4 seconds, and then something behind it shifted. Not broke, shifted. And her eyes moved from his face to his legs and back to his face, and the calculation running behind her eyes became visible in a way that her calculations usually weren't. "Put them down," Do-hyun said to the 2 armed men. He wasn't looking at the men. He was looking at Seo-rin. The men looked at Seo-rin. She looked at Do-hyun's team filling the doorway, and the corridor behind him, and the very specific posture of a man who had walked into her facility and was standing without assistance, and had done so deliberately so she could see it, and she said, "Do it." The weapons went down. Min-jae's team secured the 2 men and moved them out of the room. Do-hyun crossed the floor towards Seo-rin. His legs were shaking, not badly, not enough to show, but he felt it, and he walked through it the way he'd been walking through things for 12 years. She stood her ground. Neither of them sat. The room had furniture, a long planning table, chairs, and neither of them used it because this wasn't that kind of conversation. "How?" she said. One word looking at him. "That's not the conversation we're having," he said. Her jaw shifted. "You walked in here." "I walked out of my own house last night," he said, "into a situation you designed to end me. I walked through it, and I'm here." He stopped 2 feet from her. "The question isn't how. The question is what happens now." She held his gaze. Seo-rin had, even in the worst of what she'd done, a particular quality of directness that he had once found valuable and now recognized for what it was. Not honesty, but the performance of honesty, composure deployed strategically. He knew it because he had used the same tool himself. "You know what happens now," she said. "You're here. That means you've decided." "I decided 3 days ago," he said, "at 4 in the morning, when you came to my house." Something moved in her face. "The woman. Her name is Zuri. She's a tourist." "You said that before." His voice was even. "I didn't agree with it then either." She looked at him, and the calculation was still running. Do-hyun could see it, had always been able to read her processing even when she didn't know it was visible. And what the calculation was doing now was measuring distances between what she'd invested and what remained available, between the position she'd held and the position she was currently in. "Your network will take the facilities," she said. "The men you've captured from the last 2 nights, they'll give you everything. You'll have it all." She said this the way someone says a thing they've already made peace with. "What do you want from me, Do-hyun?" "An end," he said, formal and documented and witnessed. "The alliance. Dissolved. Your family's claims on the Incheon corridor. Released. The Northern Territory boundary stays as it is. No further challenge. No proxy actions. No information leaks about my household or my business or anyone connected to me." He looked at her steadily. "In exchange for which, what happened in this building today stays in this building, and your family retains its operations in the Northeast without interference from me." She was quiet. He let her be quiet. He had made the offer, and it was a better offer than she had any reason to expect from a man whose home she had shot at twice and whose people she had injured, and they both understood that the offer was not generosity, but efficiency. Ending this cleanly cost less than ending it completely, and he was no longer a man who spent what he didn't need to spend. "The engagement," she said finally, "dissolved. It was dissolved 2 years ago. We're formalizing what already happened." Another silence. She looked at the table, at her hands, then at him. "She changed you," Seo-rin said. It came out without strategy, which was unusual for her. Just an observation, direct and slightly wondering, as if she was still running the calculation and kept arriving at the same result. In a month she changed you. He thought about how to answer this, and then thought about whether it needed answering and decided it didn't. Do we have an agreement? She looked at him for a long moment. The composure had something different in it now. Not weaker, just more accurate. More honest than the performed version. He had a brief, strange feeling that this was the most truthful conversation they had ever had in 9 years of knowing each other. Yes, she said. We have an agreement. He called Min-jae in. The documentation process took 40 minutes, written and recorded, with Min-jae and one of Seorin's senior people as witnesses on each side. The language formal and specific in the way that language needed to be specific when it was the kind of language that people's lives ran along. Do-hyun sat for this part. His legs had earned the rest. Seorin sat across the table from him and signed her name to the dissolution of everything they had been or been intended to be. And when she was done, she looked across at him with an expression that had moved, finally, past calculation into something older and quieter. I should have stayed, she said. Very low. Not for the room, for him, or maybe just for herself. After Incheon, I should have stayed. He looked at her. He thought about 12 years. He thought about what staying would have meant, for her, for him, for the specific life that would have been built from that choice. And he thought about a nightclub called Mirage, and a woman in dark red dancing alone, and a question asked from across a partition. What's it going to take to get you on that floor? No, he said, and meant it as something other than cruelty. You were right to go. We were always wrong for each other. The injury just made it visible. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, small and real, the genuine nod, not the strategic one, and looked down at the documents. They left the facility at 8:40 in the morning. The city had fully woken up by then, traffic and noise and the particular urban energy of Seoul in full operation. Do-hyun sat in the back of the car and felt the exhaustion moving through him in long, slow waves, the accumulated cost of 2 days and 2 nights, and a body that had been asked to do things it had spent 12 years being told it couldn't do. Zuri was beside him. She had been in the secured vehicle during the operation, Min-jae's contingency, the one he'd built for the circumstance where she refused to stay behind, which she had in fact refused. And she was here now, in the morning, with the specific quality of stillness that meant she had been through something and was letting it settle. They drove for a while in silence. The city moved past the windows. She said, Is it over? Yes, he said. She absorbed this. Her hands were in her lap and she looked at them for a moment, then out the window. The agreement, she'll hold to it. Her family will enforce it. Honoring agreements they've witnessed protects their own credibility. He looked at his hands, the slight tremor in the left one, fatigue, nothing else. It's over. She nodded. Outside, a street vendor was setting up a pojangmacha, the yellow tarp catching the morning light. A woman walked past with 2 small children, neither of whom was paying any attention to where they were going, both of whom seemed fine with that. Ordinary morning, ordinary city. My visa, Zuri said. He looked at her. My tourist visa. It expired 11 days ago. She said it without drama, just fact. I've been technically illegal in this country for a week and a half. He felt something move through him, something that in another man might have produced a laugh, and in him produced a sensation that was close enough to it to be surprising. I'll have it managed. You can't just manage a visa violation. I know several people who disagree with that. She looked at him with an expression that was caught between exasperation and something warmer than exasperation, and then she looked back out the window. That's not actually reassuring. It will be resolved, he said, without irregularity. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what happens now? For real. He understood the question. Not the visa, not the legal status, not the tactical aftermath. The actual question, the one underneath all the event of the last 24 hours. What happens now? Your contract ends in 8 days, he said. I know. The return airfare is included, as we discussed. She looked at him. The looking was steady and direct, the specific quality of attention she'd had since the nightclub. Not demanding, not performing, just fully present and willing to hear whatever was actually said. I'd like you to stay, he said. He said it the way he said things that cost him, plainly, without decoration, with the full awareness that he was handing something over and couldn't control what the other person did with it. Not as staff, not as an arrangement. I'd like you to stay because He paused. Not because he didn't know the words, but because he was testing whether he was willing to say them to another person's face in a moving vehicle at 8:40 in the morning. He decided he was. Because I haven't felt like a person in a long time, and I do, when you're there. The car moved, the city moved past. She looked at him for a long moment, and he held it. Held her gaze without managing it, without retreating into the composed distance that had kept him functional for 12 years. That's not a small thing to say, she said finally. No, he agreed. It isn't. She looked out the window. He waited. He was good at waiting, had spent 12 years becoming expert at it. But this particular waiting had a different quality than anything he'd practiced before. More exposed. I was aware of his own heartbeat in a way that he usually wasn't, and aware that being aware of it was itself significant. I have a job in Atlanta, she said. Lease on an apartment. My cousin checks on the plant. A pause. I have a life there. I know. A whole actual life. I know that too. She turned back from the window and looked at him with something that had moved through the full range of its processing and arrived, finally, at something clear. I'll need to go back, she said, to handle things. Properly. Not run away, just deal with it like an adult. She held his gaze. And then I'd want to come back. If the offer is still, it will be, he said. No hesitation, no performance of deliberation, just the true answer, immediate. Something in her face opened, not dramatically. She was not a dramatic person. It was one of the things he had recognized about her from the beginning, but visibly, genuinely, the thing behind the composure allowing itself to be seen for a moment. Okay, she said. One word. He heard everything in it. They rode the rest of the way to the estate in silence that had changed its quality completely from the silence they'd started with, become something the two of them were inside together, rather than two separate people enduring. The estate, when they arrived, looked the way places look after violence has passed through. Not destroyed, but changed in its atmosphere, carrying the memory of what it had been used for. The damaged gate had been secured with a temporary barrier. The east window was still boarded. 3 of Do-hyun's men were visible in the grounds, moving through the cleanup that always followed these nights. Do-hyun got out of the car. He stood on his own grounds in the morning light, on his own 2 feet, and looked at the damage and felt it as information rather than defeat. Things that could be repaired. Things that had already cost what they cost and were done costing. Min-jae appeared from the east side, phone in hand, looking like a man who had been awake for 26 hours and intended to continue for several more. He stopped when he saw Do-hyun standing by the car. Report, Do-hyun said. Lee and Cho are at the hospital. Lee's in surgery, Cho is stable and awake, and already arguing with the nurses. Min-jae glanced at his phone. Intelligence team has started processing the facility documentation. Preliminary findings suggest. Seorin's contact inside our network was a man named Kwon. Outer tier, been with us 3 years. He's been located. Manage it. Yes, sir. He paused. There's also been contact from the Park Hwang Syndicate. They're distancing from Seorin's action formally and requesting a conversation. Tell them they can make an appointment in 2 weeks. Yes, sir. Another pause. And the Jeolla connection is asking whether last night changes any existing arrangements. Tell them no. Last night was a family matter and is resolved as such. Min-jae nodded. He was doing the thing he did when he had something more to say and was deciding its moment. Do-hyun waited for it. Kwon, Min-jae said finally, more quietly. He was the one who provided the information about the staff hire. About Zuri. Do-hyun looked at him. He connected the timing, the search, the hire, her presence in the house. And he told Seorin. Min-jae's voice was even. He's the reason she accelerated. Do-hyun absorbed this. A man who had been in his outer network for 3 years, who had watched and calculated and found a use for what he saw. It was in the cold geography of the business he was in, completely ordinary. Information moved. People used it. That was the world. Handle it according to protocol, he said, and then close the outer tier entirely. Full review. Yes, sir. Min-jae looked at him with the eyes of a man who had managed 14 years inside a world that ran on information and leverage, and had arrived, after all of it, at a point where he understood what actually mattered. "She's good for you," he said. Not sir-bracketed, just said. Do-hyun looked at him for a moment. "Go get some sleep, Min-jae." "I'll sleep when Lee is out of surgery." He went. Do-hyun stood in the morning light of his damaged estate and watched him go, and felt the particular weight of a life that had accumulated this many good people in it, this much loyalty and function and years, and had only recently, only in the last month, started understanding what to do with that. He went inside. The next 8 days were the specific kind of ordinary that arrives after extraordinary, the reversion to daily texture after the texture has been stripped. The estate was repaired in increments, gate replaced, window reglazed, the south side grounds reconfigured slightly to address the vulnerability the attack had exposed. Do-hyun met with his network in structured sequence, managing the aftermath of the Seorin situation through the channels that these things moved through, and the aftermath resolved with the efficiency of something that had been cleanly ended rather than left open. He worked. That was what he had always done and continued to do. The empire ran on attention, and he gave it attention, the way he always had, with the same rigor and the same precision. The difference was the evenings. In the evenings, he and Zuri sat in the kitchen or walked, the two of them, in the grounds where the pine trees did their thing with the fading light, and talked. Not about the business, not about Seorin, or what had happened or what might happen, about Atlanta, about what she did there. She was a physical therapist, which explained certain things about the way she'd handled him from the first night, the matter-of-fact confidence around bodies and limitation and recovery that had felt so different from anyone else's approach to his situation. She talked about her cousin, the one who checked on the plants, who sounded like someone who had strong opinions about everything and was usually right. She talked about the job that was waiting for her, the practice where she worked, the patients she'd been thinking about. He listened. He was, it turned out, good at listening when the listening was something he wanted to do. He told her things too. Not the business, but himself. The parts of himself that weren't the business. What Seoul looked like to him from the inside, the parts of the city that had meaning to him beyond their operational value. His mother, who had died when he was 32, and who he had not been able to grieve correctly at the time, and sometimes thought he was still in the process of getting right. The dancing, from before. What it had been, not as a social function, but as the specific physical vocabulary he'd had when he was 23, and his body was something he moved through the world in rather than something he managed. She listened. She listened the way she did everything, fully, without performance, giving him the complete attention of someone who was actually interested rather than someone who thought they should seem interested. On the 7th day, Dr. Shin came to the estate. Do-hyun had finally called him, had resisted it for weeks, afraid of what a clinical perspective would do to the thing he was experiencing, afraid that a medical framework would reduce it to something that could be managed and measured and potentially lost. But the responsible version of himself had prevailed, and Dr. Shin came and ran the examination that Do-hyun had been avoiding. Dr. Shin was a careful man, a thorough man, a man who had treated Do-hyun's condition for 10 years and had never once offered him false hope or unnecessary despair. He ran his examination in the therapy room for 90 minutes and then sat across from Do-hyun in the main room with the expression of a man who has found a result that doesn't fit his existing framework and is deciding how to present it. The neurological function, Dr. Shin said, has partially restored. He paused. Let that sit. I can't explain the mechanism. The injury pattern from 12 years ago should not permit this degree of recovery at this stage, but the function is there, measurably, testably there. I've run the assessments 3 times. He looked at his notes and then at Do-hyun. It's incomplete. It may progress further or it may stabilize where it is. I won't speculate about the ceiling. But it's real, Do-hyun said. It's real. Dr. Shin looked at him over his glasses with the expression of a man who has enough professional integrity to say the next sentence even though it exceeded his usual vocabulary. Whatever has happened in the last month, it has had a measurable physiological effect that I cannot account for through any mechanism I currently understand. A pause. I'd like to document it. Document it, Do-hyun said, and send me the protocol for continuing the therapy. Dr. Shin looked at him with something that was professional and also, underneath, simply human. The look of a person who is glad to be seeing what he's seeing. Yes, he said. I'll send it tonight. He told Zuri about the appointment that evening. They were in the kitchen. The kitchen, always the kitchen, it had become the room where the true things happened between them. And she was making tea, and he told her what Dr. Shin had said, the restoration and the uncertainty of the ceiling and the protocol, and she listened with her back to him and then turned when he finished. Her expression was complex. He had learned to read the complexity, had been learning it for a month, the specific frequencies of her face. This one had several things in it, the professional part of her, the physical therapist, the person who understood bodies and recovery, and beneath that something more personal, something that had been present since the nightclub and had been growing in the weeks since in the way things grew when they weren't being forced. You should have told me earlier, she said, about the progress. I could have helped. I know. I'm a PT, Do-hyun. I know how to... I know. He met her eyes. I wasn't ready for someone to help. I needed to know if it was real before I let anyone else see it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. The real nod. The one that meant she understood not just the words, but the thing behind them. Okay, she said, but from now on. From now on, he said. She turned back to the tea, added something to it, then said without turning, the protocol he gave you. Let me look at it before you start. Yes, he said. She brought the tea to the island and sat across from him, and they drank it in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over the weeks. The silence of two people who had stopped performing ease and found the actual thing. And outside the kitchen window, the grounds were quiet and lit by the low evening light, and the pine trees were doing what they always did with whatever light was available. She left on a Tuesday. He drove her to the airport himself, drove, which he hadn't done in 12 years, relearning the specific coordination of it in the days before with the focused concentration he applied to everything he decided to learn. Min-jae had tried, diplomatically, to suggest a driver. Do-hyun had declined. He parked in the short-term structure and walked with her to the departure level. Walked steadily, without the wall, with the cane that Dr. Shin had prescribed as a transitional measure and that he used without shame because practicality was not the same as defeat, and he had learned this. Zuri walked beside him at his pace without adjusting for it, the way she'd been walking beside him since the first night. At the security entrance, she stopped and turned. She looked at him with all the things that had accumulated over the weeks, the morning kitchens and the estate under fire and the warehouse in Mappo, and the drive home in the morning light and the evenings in the grounds and everything that had been built in the space that opened up when she'd grabbed the handles of his chair in a nightclub and asked why he wasn't dancing. I'll call when I land, she said. Yes. And when I've sorted the apartment? Yes. It might take a few weeks. There's the job notice, and the lease has terms, and my cousin is going to have opinions about all of it. Something moved in her expression. She's going to have a great many opinions about the Korean crime boss situation. Tell her the crime has substantially reduced, he said. Zuri almost laughed. Not quite. The almost laugh was something he had catalogued with some care over the weeks, the specific quality of it, the shape it made in her face. I'll pass that along, she said. She reached out and put her hand on his chest. Same hand, same place as the corridor, the night of the assault. The gesture that wasn't steadying him, just contact, just the specific language of touch that she used when words were working but not sufficient. He put his hand over hers. Her fingers were warm. Do-hyun, she said. I know, he said. Because he did. She went through security. He watched until she was through the scanner and had collected her bag and turned back to look at him one more time. The look across a distance, not a goodbye look, a see you when I see you look. And then she moved into the departures hall and was gone. He stood at the entrance to the security line for a moment. The airport moved around him in its usual way. Families, business people, the constant managed chaos of a city connecting itself to the rest of the world. He turned and walked back to the parking structure. His cane on the floor, his own weight on his own legs, the quiet particular work of a body rebuilding what it had nearly lost. The week she was gone had a specific quality that he worked with rather than against. I was not good at waiting passively, had never been. So he used the time the way he used everything, with directed intention. The physical therapy protocol that Dr. Shin had sent and Zuri had reviewed and annotated before she left, with notes in her precise handwriting that told him things about her professional self that he found he wanted to know more of. He ran the protocol every morning. The progress was not dramatic. It was consistent, which was better. He met with Min-jae daily, managing the transition he'd mentioned, restructuring certain responsibilities, creating the succession lines that should have existed years ago but hadn't because he had been too consumed with managing everything himself. The Kwon situation was resolved, the outer tier review was completed, the Park Hwang contact was managed with the appropriate distance. Seoul continued being Seoul, and his piece of it continued running, and he sat in fewer of the meetings personally and spent more of the reclaimed time doing things that were not the business. He walked in the estate grounds every evening, with the cane, and then, by the third week, without it for portions of the circuit. The pine trees did their thing with the evening light, and he watched them with more attention than he'd given them in 7 years of owning the property. Zuri called. Every day, usually in the evenings her time, which was the mornings his. She told him about the apartment, the job notice, her cousin's opinions, which were, as predicted, extensive and delivered with significant energy. She told him about Atlanta in December, the specific gray cold of it, the neighborhood she'd been living in and was now ending her lease on, the life she was dismantling, not because it hadn't been hers, but because another one had become possible. He told her about the therapy progress, about the estate repairs, about a book he'd been reading. He had started reading again, fiction, which he hadn't done in years because there had never seemed to be time or reason. He told her which parts he wanted to discuss, and she told him her opinions, and her opinions were specific and occasionally contradicted his, and he found this, consistently, satisfying. She came back on a Thursday, 6 weeks after she'd left. He was at the airport again, parked in the same structure, waiting at the arrivals level with the specific patience of a man who had spent 12 years learning patience and was applying it to something that felt for the first time worth applying it to. She came through the arrivals door with one large suitcase and the rolling carry-on she'd left with, and she saw him immediately, and something in her face did what it had done in the hospital corridor, in the kitchen, in the car on the way home from Mappo. The thing that opened. She walked to him and he was standing, cane in hand, but standing on his own ground. And she stopped in front of him and looked at him with the morning of 6 weeks of phone calls in her eyes, and said, "You look different." "So do you," he said. "Good, different, or bad different?" "Good," he said. "Very good." She smiled. The real smile, not the almost, the one that reached everything. He realized, been working toward that smile for the last 6 weeks without knowing that was what he was doing. They went back to the estate. He drove. She watched Seoul out the window and said things about it, the way it looked to her now, familiar and strange in the specific combination that belonged to places you'd left and returned to. He listened and occasionally said things back, and the car was full of the easy warmth of two people who had talked every day for 6 weeks and were now in the same vehicle again. At the estate, she walked through the rooms and noticed what had been repaired and what had changed. She stopped in the kitchen and ran her hand along the island counter, and he watched her from the doorway and thought about all the mornings. She looked up and found him watching. "Your cup is still on the counter," she said. He looked. She'd started the habit on her second day, and he'd left it there for the 6 weeks she'd been gone, the plain cup on the counter by the supplement cabinet. "I didn't see a reason to move it," he said. She looked at the cup and then at him, and then she nodded, the small real nod, and said, "Okay," in the way that meant several things at once, all of them true. They settled into the life. The days had texture and routine, his work, her work. She'd found a position at a rehabilitation clinic in Mappo, which had made them both laugh with a quality that meant something beyond the coincidence. The evenings that belonged to them in the kitchen, or the grounds, or the main room where he had put a table for the board games she'd mentioned liking, and which he learned at her pace and won at about a third of the time, which was enough to make the games interesting without being enough to make her let him win. Dr. Shin came back at 3 months, ran the assessment again, reported continued progress, the left side more than the right, the balance improving, the endurance extending. Still incomplete, still without ceiling, still without mechanism that he could account for. "Does it matter?" Do-hyun asked him, in the therapy room, with Zuri sitting in the chair in the corner with the annotated protocol on her tablet. Dr. Shin considered this with the care he gave everything. Medically, he said, I'd like to understand it. Practically, he looked at his patient standing in the therapy room without assistance, 12 years after a basement in Incheon. Practically no, it doesn't matter at all. On the anniversary of the night at Mirage, exactly 1 year from the night a woman had grabbed the handles of his wheelchair without asking permission and told his bodyguards to relax, giants. Do-hyun told Zuri they were going out. She asked where. He told her she'd see. She looked at him with the expression she wore when she suspected he was being specific in the way that meant he'd already decided, and the question was ceremonial, and she went and got her coat. He drove. She recognized the district before she recognized the building, and when she recognized the building, she turned to look at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not any of the cataloged ones, something new, something that had surprise in it, but was mostly something else. Do-hyun. Yes. We're going to Mirage. Yes. You can't. She stopped, looked at his hands on the wheel, at his posture, at the cane in the back seat, at him. You're going to dance. I'm going to try, he said. You taught me that distinction. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked out the windshield at the glass tower with its lights running up the face of the building, and he could see her profile in the exterior light, the line of her jaw, the way she was processing something that had moved past surprise into something quieter. Okay, she said, very soft. They went inside. The club was what it had been. The music, the levels, the particular energy of a place that existed to let people step out of their regular geometry for a few hours. The staff recognized Do-hyun and managed it correctly, efficiently, without fuss. They had a table on the main floor, sets, not the mezzanine. He had asked for the main floor specifically. They sat. He ordered water. She ordered something with fruit in it that she said was primarily decorative and then drank with evident appreciation. They watched the floor. The music was something current that he didn't know the name of but had a rhythm that worked. She looked at him. Ready? She said. He thought about the word. About a nightclub a year ago and a question asked from across a security partition and a hand held out. Not to help him, just an offered hand, the kind you extend before a dance. About everything that had lived between that night and this one. About 12 years of building a life around the shape of what he'd lost, and 1 month of discovering that the shape was not the only possibility. He stood up. No cane. His legs under him, imperfect and present and his. He held out his hand. She looked at it, looked at him. Her eyes were bright, and the brightness was the kind that was not tears but was adjacent to them, the kind that meant something had moved through and left its mark. She took his hand. They walked to the dance floor. They stood in the center of it, this specific floor, this specific place, and the music moved through the air and through the floor and into them, and he felt it the way he'd felt it a year ago, the thing his body remembered even when he'd given up on the memory. He wasn't good at it. That was still true. He moved with the particular careful intention of someone reconstructing a vocabulary from first principles, and there were moments when his weight shifted wrong and she was there, not correcting him, just there, adjusting with him the way she'd been adjusting since the beginning. They danced. Not 3 songs this time. More. Enough that his legs told him, eventually, that enough was enough. And he listened to them because listening to the body was something he was relearning along with everything else. They went back to the table and he sat, and she sat across from him, and the music continued around them, and the room moved with its usual life. She was looking at him with something in her face that was finished processing and had arrived somewhere. Do-hyun, she said. Yes. She put her hand on the table, palm up, an offered hand the same as a year ago, the same gesture in the same building with everything that had happened in between contained in it. He looked at her hand, at her face, at the woman who had grabbed his wheelchair without asking and laughed at his bodyguards and dared him to stand and had been standing beside him in every way that mattered, since. He put his hand in hers. He reached into his jacket pocket with his other hand and took out the ring that he had spent 3 weeks selecting and which Min-jae had known about and said nothing about, and which Zuri's cousin had been consulted on by phone at considerable length because some decisions required a structural opinion from someone with long-term standing. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it. The light caught it. Her breath shifted, small, involuntary, the breath of something arriving. He said, "I told you I hadn't felt like a person in a long time." His voice was even. He wanted it even. He wanted her to hear the words clearly, without the texture of performance. "You gave that back to me. Not by fixing anything, just by being there and being exactly what you are." He looked at her face, which was doing the new thing, the one he'd never catalogued before, the one that was entirely itself. "I'd like you to stay. Not as the woman who came back, as the person this is built around, if you want that." Zuri looked at the ring, looked at his face. The room around them was its usual busy self, the music and the movement and the indifferent, beautiful chaos of a city on a Friday night, and they were in the center of it, still. She picked up the ring. She put it on her own finger, unhurried, deliberate, the gesture of a woman who had decided and was not performing the decision, but simply executing it. Then she looked at him with the real smile, full, nothing held back. "I already stayed," she said. "The ring is just paperwork." He felt something move through him that he had no name for and did not try to name. He simply held her hand across the table in a nightclub called Mirage, on the anniversary of a night that had changed everything, and felt the warmth in his legs and the music in the floor, and her hand in his, and understood, without needing to say it, without it requiring language, that the greatest distance he'd ever covered had nothing to do with his legs. It had been the distance between the man he'd been managing to be and the man she'd seen from a dance floor. He'd spent 12 years in a wheelchair, learning that some things couldn't be recovered. He'd spent 1 year learning that some things only looked that way.